In this video, we'll talk about game mechanics. A lot of these ideas are based on Miguel Sicart's article, Defining Game Mechanics. There's a lot of different ways to think and talk about game mechanics, but here are a couple simple definitions. We can think of game mechanics as the verbs in a game. Some games allow you to run or hide or shoot or spin or wait, among many other options. So it's these actions and how they affect the state of the game that are the mechanics. Another way to think of it is that game mechanics are the things that participants are allowed to do in the game world, the ways that they do those actions, and how that leads to a compelling interactive experience. So why should we care about game mechanics? Well, they're very helpful to consider when producing games or interactive artworks. They also give us another tool to analyze and talk about games and interactivity. So along with rules, fictional worlds, goals, conflicts, and outcomes, mechanics are one of the key building blocks of these experiences. They also help us to draw connections between games that might otherwise seem unrelated on the surface. Gamers and game design theorists don't always agree about the difference between rules and mechanics, or even that there is a difference between the two. The way we'll frame it here is that rules and mechanics often overlap, but they're not always exactly the same. We can think of rules as how much and what type of consequences or changes to the game state are allowed at any given time, and mechanics as actions that participants can perform to make those changes. So the distinction is a little bit more between actions for mechanics and consequences for rules. Now throughout this video you'll hear me mention participants, and that can refer to human players of a game. It could also refer to the computer or an autonomous player that still is bound by the rules of a game. So let's break this down with an example. In The Legend of Zelda: Breath of the Wild, there's a mechanic for sprinting. So the rule around that mechanic is that participants have a limited amount of stamina, and that participants need stamina in order to sprint. The mechanic says that participants can use the sprint mechanic to run faster, and that sprinting reduces the participant's stamina. Now, depending on how you look at it, again, some of these distinctions might overlap, and that's fine. We can break this down a little bit further by talking about the different types of game mechanics. Core mechanics are the actions that are used repeatedly by participants to achieve a desired state of the game. That's often the end state or the win state. We can see some examples from Mario Kart, where the core mechanic is racing, Pac-Man, where the core mechanics are chasing or collecting, and Katamari Damacy, where the core mechanic is also collecting. Now, of course, each of those core mechanics actually consists of several different things, right? So if we think about racing, there's steering and braking and accelerating. For chasing, there's direction and speed and so on. We can break down core mechanics even further into primary core mechanics, and that is an action or actions that lead the participants directly to a desired state in the game. And again, that's often the end state or the win state. These mechanics are actions that are available throughout the game and that are relatively easy to enact by the participants. So again, in the case of Mario Kart, some primary core mechanics are steering, braking, and accelerating. Those are all required to race. For Pac-Man, a primary core mechanic is changing direction. And for Katamari Damacy, the primary core mechanic is rolling the Katamari around. We could also identify secondary core mechanics. So these are actions that help participants achieve a desired state, which is often the win state, but they can't be used exclusively to win, although they are helpful, and they're not always available in the game. So some examples of those include the speed boost in Mario Kart and the power pellet in Pac-Man, which turns the tables on the ghosts and allows you to collect points. Katamari Damacy doesn't really seem to have secondary core mechanics, and that's common for games. It's not that all games have to have all these mechanics. This is just giving us some ways to drill down and talk about the way different games operate. Now we could also think about uncategorized mechanics, and those are actions that aren't really tied to the goal or the reward structure of a game. Some good examples of those are in Mario Kart, honking the horn in Grand Prix mode. That's a really fun mechanic, but all it does is honk your horn. It has no real effect other than making a sound on the state of the game. Pac-Man doesn't really seem to have any uncategorized mechanics, but in Katamari Damacy, if you're very fast at rolling up your Katamaris, you'll get to see meteors or shooting stars next to your constellations. Again, it doesn't really affect the state of the game, it's just a little added bonus. So that's an overview of game mechanics. These aren't necessarily hard and fast rules, and there's lots of folks that think about these issues a little bit differently, and that's okay. The point is, this gives us some really nice tools for building and talking about games and interactivity.